we're also going to be streaming it on Facebook. So tonight, as we start, there's a couple things that we're going to do. We're going to, this is a two-parter tonight. We're going to talk about the class as a whole, and then we're going to actually do the first session. So this is really a two-part thing, and normally this is going to be about 90 minutes. Now, Mike says perfect. So, um, I will say that part of what we're doing now is a little different than what we've been doing over the last, well, I would say 20 years.
Yeah.
Because we've been much more text based over the last 20 years for Wednesday night. But as I'm going to explain, we used to be doing what we're doing now, which is more of an overview, Jewish subjects, things like that. Um, Kind of an overview of Jewish learning. But over the last few decades, I can say decades now, it's been more text based, which in a way is a little bit easier for me because I know what the text is going to be, and we can just go through the text. So whether it was the Torah or the Talmud, and we're going to talk about those things on Wednesday nights, but if it was one of those things, I knew what it was, and we could just work off of the text and read the next pages, and I knew what the pages were. And even when we were doing the Talmud, I was able to. Mike, are you seeing if we're on Facebook? All right. Um, and none of this really would be possible the way we're doing. It is? Yes? Yes? Okay. All right. Okay. So none of this would be possible if we didn't have the technology in place. And for that, I really want to thank Michael Carlin because he's done an amazing job over the last couple of years getting all of our tech together. And so none of this would be possible if it wasn't for him. Some of the classes that we're going to do on Wednesday nights, if I'm not here, if I'm not in town, we will be able to do it, assuming I'm on a decent time zone, we'll be able to do it. We'll be able to do it virtually. So that is going to happen. But when we're not, when we're not in person, and we're all online, it might be easier for people to jump in and to take part in the discussions. But we want you, wherever you are, um, to understand that if you can't come to a class, it's going to be saved. And then for the most part, most of the classes are independent of each other. So you don't have to be at all of them.
We lost you, Mark.
Yeah, I lost you too.
Is your mic muted, Rabbi?
He lost audio power
Okay.
earlier.
We're hearing each other, but not Mark.
Yeah,
All right.
something happened to the mic there.
We're good again. Sorry.
Oh,
Apologies.
here he is.
As I was thanking Mike, Mike Carland, we lost it again, but hopefully it'll work. I don't know. It's the second time it did that. So, all right. So as I said, it's been a long time since we've done classes like this, but it's not the first time. And I'm going to show you, because we have the multimedia that we didn't have 20 years ago, I'm going to share with you what we're going to be learning and how we're going to get there. So let me do that. So, So these, oop. It is not showing. Hold it. There it goes.
Ah.
So this is the syllabus, if you will. We may deviate from this order. So this may not be the order of what we're going to do, but it is the subjects of the classes we're going to be doing. So we've got tonight the very difficult way to begin. Who is a Jew? What is Judaism? But we really got to start there at the beginning. So we're going to be doing that in just a moment. And then we're going to be moving into subjects like Jewish theology, Jewish concepts of God, Jewish time, talking about the Jewish calendar as a concept. What was how did the Jewish calendar come to us? And the development of that. Then we get into what is in the Jewish calendar, Shabbat, the holidays, etc. Then we're going to be talking about what we've been talking about for the last 20 years, what we've been really spending a lot of time in, and that is the texts themselves. Looking at a macro picture of what is the Torah, what is the Tanakh, a little bit on how the theories of how it came to us, both the traditional views and the more scientific views of how the Torah came to us. And then we move into the Talmud, which we also have been reading over the last couple of years, the Midrash. Later Jewish law, which we don't talk about that much. We don't talk about it as much in the non-Orthodox world, but we'll be talking a little bit about how Jewish law continued to develop beyond the Talmud after the Talmudic period, in the last 1,500 years. And then we'll be talking about how, at the same time, if we're talking about how Jewish law developed, how did Jewish fiction, if you will, develop? How did Agadah, how did Jewish legend develop after that as well? Because a lot of that is in the Midrash, as we've studied, because we studied the Midrash as well for a long time, but we're going to talk about what happened after Midrash, if you will, after the formal text of the Midrash. Then we're going to be looking at Jewish prayer. And again, maybe not necessarily in this order, but the Siddur and how Jewish prayer developed. Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Jewish history overview, which will be several weeks, probably 3 or 4 weeks. And again, some of the other classes might be 1 or 2 weeks. They may be 1 or they might be 2 weeks. Jewish history will definitely be more than 2 weeks. But then after that, there's going to be some special kind of focuses. One of them is Judaism and Christianity, both historic and kind of like where we are today. And then European Jewish history and the development of Yiddish, American Jewish history, anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and early Zionism, and then kind of the history of Israel over the last 77 years. Those are, again, some of those the Israel history will probably be 3 or 4 weeks. Jewish communities around the world, life cycle, looking at Jewish life cycle. This next part, Jewish living, Jewish ethics, and current issues, that's going to be several weeks, and we'll touch on that potentially could be, 6 or 7 weeks as we look at some issues that are issues, ones that we discuss, ones that are part of the political situations and some of the topics that are in the headlines. What are the Jewish feelings about those kind of things, like abortion or euthanasia or same-sex marriage, and some of those issues that, what does Judaism teach us about those things? Which then gets into the love and sex in Jewish tradition, which we'll mention in a second, and then Jews in space, Jews in music, Jews in film and TV. So these are all some of the subjects on contemporary Jewish life that are also interesting. So we're really, look, any of these individual classes, any of these individual subjects could have a 10-week version, any of them. So this is really in every week, even if it's a couple weeks, it's a macro look at these subjects. It's an overview look. And I will be providing people with, and you'll see in a second, when we look at today's topic, where you can read more about it, the read more about it page. So that'll be there for you too. And if the read more about it isn't enough for you as you go through that and you want to learn even more, we have a library here at the temple, but I have, as most people know, a very big library at my house, and I do love lending books to people, and I have no issue lending books to people if there's a subject that you really want to know more about. There's a good chance that I have a book about that. So these are the subjects, these are the classes that we're going to focus. So you can imagine this is like over a year, right? So this is going to be this is a long journey, and of course it's just part of the journey, but this is something that as I said, I've done most of these in the past, but in some cases it's been many, many years since we visited them. One of the most famous, of course, of the things that I visited in the past was what became the most famous, as most of you who've been around for many, many years, like Judith will tell you, the most famous, of course, was love and sex from the Jewish tradition, right? That's the one that's the one that that people just couldn't seem to get enough of. That was yeah, that's part of the journey. But and again, when that was done, and I will just remind people or share with you what happened when that happened. That was 23 years ago, actually a little over 23 years ago. That was 2002. And yeah, and so this was the day. This was the flyer. All of this excitement that we had was this flyer. And it was quite amazing how much how much came out of this discussion. I will tell you that I had no idea at first that it would be, and it was not intended to be something that created so much excitement. I mean, I understood that sex sells. It's not like I was naive about that. What I didn't know was that it would have a life of its own. And a lot of people thought, well, he's just going to keep, pushing the envelope. And as most people know, in the last 23 years, I haven't really done that. I think I've been very well behaved, and I think that for those, yeah, there's been a little bit, but I think most people thought, is he going to, is that going to be a normal kind of occurrence? I will tell you that, here's, just an example. It took years for this story to get off. When and I didn't really discuss it with my kids until they were old enough to even, kind of take this in. But you can see, this was supposed to be February 19th at 7:30. It ended up being not at the temple. It ended up being, for those that remember, at the Hyatt. And there were 300 people that showed up at the Hyatt. So, yeah, it ended up being pretty wild. And it made every news channel in Los Angeles that day. That's not an exaggeration. Every single news channel opened their news. So obviously it was a slow news day, but we saw, what was happening, and I kind of went with it because I knew that the potential to do something, big was there, but it was also, look, I wanted there to be a sincere discussion about it. And I also knew that if this was done right, it would give the synagogue, and it would give the work that I'm doing some boost. And I had only been at the synagogue at that point for 2 years. So, I allowed it to play out. So this is a little bit about the history. The video of what I'm about to show you is no longer up. After about literally 20 years or 22 years, it's not up. So it was on every news channel in California ahead of time. And then once that happened, then it had a life of its own, and it ended up being part of The Daily Show. Now, I will say that in 2002, The Daily Show was not The Daily Show that it was a couple years later. It was really the 2004 election when The Daily Show took off. But Jon Stewart led with it that day, and I didn't know that this was going to happen. I had no idea that this was going to happen. It happened to be Valentine's Day, so he led Valentine's Day with this thing. So I wish I could show the video. I'm going to play about a minute of this. And it was still the discussions about it before it happened. And anyone who went to it will tell you, again, it was the 19th. It was a very PG-13 discussion about sex. It was not what people thought maybe in their minds this was going to happen, but it was I thought it was very good, and it was very appropriate, and it was not prurient. It was meaningful, and I think a lot of stuff that was said was important. So here's the audio. I'm going to play you about a minute of the audio, and one second. This is, again, for people who aren't here. This is just a taste of what happened. Here you go.
Yes, my friends, it is Valentine's Day, and if today is about anything, it's about pleasing your loved ones. And let's face it, no one does that quite as well or as often as a veteran porn star. And that's why a rabbi in Southern California has hired former porn actress Nina Hartley to teach an adult education sex seminar for his congregants at Temple Beth Ami. By the way, the key word on that sign, reform.
That was when we had a sign that said Reform.
The rabbi, Mark Blazer, surprisingly that is not his porn name, that's his rabbinical name, explains why he couldn't lead his congregants to the promised land.
The idea was actually congregants who wanted to expand what we had already done as part of our adult education lectures on the topic of sexuality. And so they said, can we get somebody else to come in? Because quite frankly, I had thought everything I knew about sexuality, which is, compared to Nina, fairly limited.
Rabbi Blazer was then given the coveted Understatement of the Year award.
Yes, the coveted Understatement of the Year award. So, yeah, that was real. I still can't believe that happened. But listen, I knew the media was going to. I mean, once I knew the media was going to go crazy, I let it happen. And I have to say that I'm still proud of the way it happened. But again, it says more about our society than anything else that this kind of thing became such a big deal. But again, it's not like it forced me to continue to find new ways to push the envelope. That's not my goal. I've never been somebody who just wanted to push the envelope. But yeah, so that's what happened the last time. Would I do now? Interestingly, I did not hire her. I did not pay her. She volunteered, and she speaks at colleges, and she's spoken at many universities over the years. And so I would say that I would do it again. And if it is the right opportunity to have this discussion, I think 23 years later, there's a lot we could add to the discussion about sexuality that's happened over the last 23 years, because the proliferation of adult content on the internet, for example, that didn't happen in 2002. I mean, it's happened in the last 23 years. So there's a lot of things that we would talk about that I think would maybe be interesting to talk about. But so is it possible? Yeah, I haven't thought about it. When I asked her, we had a mutual friend, somebody who worked with my dad, was friends with her, had worked with her at a lobbying organization, and that's how I knew her. It was not through work. It was not through any mutual work. She actually, I was just reading an article just now that Leonardo DiCaprio was talking about the one movie that he wished he had done, and it was Boogie Nights, which was the movie that she was in, actually. But that's again, hold on to your hat. No, I'm not saying that I haven't talked to her about it. I don't think I've talked to her since, but I do, it is a subject that isn't less relevant. And I will tell you that, again, my goal is to get people excited about Jewish learning, and 300 people for a Jewish education thing is not so bad. I will tell you that I'm excited about this class. I'm excited about the fact that we get to do this. A lot of I will say, as we, before we start the first class, that, it's interesting because a lot of times people, I would say to some extent, I was built in a lab to do this class in the sense that, I like to say that I'm like the Ivan Drago from Rocky of Jewish learning, because I was surrounded by Jewish experiences from an early age, and so I was given the opportunities and the exposure to things at an early age, and I was interested in it, and develop that interest. And I will tell you again, a lot of people know this too, was that it was because of this guy. It was my dad. So, yeah, it's an old picture, but this was from his office. And a lot of people, were under the impression that he was a rabbi. He wasn't. He was actually not personally, his own personal practice was not he was not very religious. He was not very into book learning himself, though he actually ended up writing 3 books, including a history of Jewish LA, but he was not a book person. Yeah, he was a DJ who became an activist, and that picture was one of the things that he was doing. I sometimes think, like, what would he be doing now? With after October 7th, what his mind would have been blown. In a way, I'm kind of glad he's not here, because I don't know how he would have processed the level of anti-Semitism. Yeah, but I mean, it's insane. So, look, I was officiating at a funeral yesterday, and somebody came up to me and said, your dad was an amazing guy. She was an Israeli woman who, just said, I knew your father. And then somebody else, when they heard my last name, said, was your father Phil Blay? And so it still happens. I mean, it happened yesterday. It doesn't happen every day, but it happened yesterday. And it was interesting because when I decided to go to rabbinical school, it's not like he encouraged me to do it. He wasn't sad I did it, but he also felt like you don't have to be a rabbi to be a Jewish activist, which is what I wanted to be. I always wanted to be. But I also was given, a Jewish day school education, and I went to Heschel as a kid. I was one of the first students at Heschel, and I had amazing Jewish education after that, Jewish experiences after that. And so people always said, you're going to be a rabbi one day. And I just didn't think I would be, because I didn't think of myself I didn't have that feeling that I was going to be able to be a spiritual leader, or that I was holy enough, or whatever my concept of it is. I just was like, I don't talk to God regularly, and God hasn't told me you're going to be a rabbi. So I just didn't know. I thought that that's part of what happened. So it didn't happen. And so I just, people would say it, and I would just go, okay, whatever. So, and so I knew that, and I always knew that, like, I was obsessed with Jewish learning and Jewish information. I was the kind of kid who read encyclopedias, but I read the Jewish encyclopedia, what we call the Encyclopedia Judaica. I would sit for hours reading, going down a rabbit hole on subjects on Judaism. And so, I will show you that by the time I was in high school, people were already, imagining that my future would look something like this. This was in my yearbook from Granada. Lisa Barton was at Granada. I didn't do this cartoon, and I actually am offended by it a little bit, but the point is that people, and this was not done by a Jewish kid, this was done by a Gentile friend. And so people were like, dude, this kid's really into Judaism. So yeah, that says the future president of the JDL. That never happened, by the way. I never became the president of the JDL. But even at Heschel, people at a Jewish day school, people thought I was way too into to Jewish stuff. So I'll show you. Even before that, people were like, "Yeah, he's way into Jewish stuff." At a Jewish school, remember? I mean, people were like, take it down a notch. And it wasn't like it wasn't because I was, running around telling everybody to be more religious, but yeah, this is what they put in my Heschel. That was my Heschel. So, and that was at a Jewish school. So, yeah, this was what to some extent I was born to do. And I love doing it. And it's, every rabbi has their thing, has their gimmick or their shtick that they do. Some play the guitar and some, play basketball. And I don't do any of those things well, but I do love Jewish information. And so I love sharing it with people, and I love being able to guide people in this. And so that's why, to some extent, this was, this is something that I've always loved doing. It is not an easy thing when we kind of open it up into different subjects. I've enjoyed doing the last the last few decades. Now I keep saying it because it's amazing. I think it's decades. I enjoyed the freedom of kind of having the text guide us, and not having to be the guide in a way. But this is also something that it's definitely the time has come to do this, and I've been encouraged to do it, and it's also going to be part of the adult B'nai Mitzvah classes that we did when we used to do adult B'nai Mitzvah more frequently. We had this kind of class which allowed people to learn kind of more more of an introduction to Judaism kind of overview, which is what this is. So with that, and almost exactly right on the time that I hoped to do this, we now start our first class, so to speak, which is the opening of this, which is what is Judaism and who is a Jew? This subject, again, is one where you have to almost define it. If we're going to do this Jewish journey, what is it? What does it mean to be Jewish? And so I'm going to actually open it up. And again, I'm going to I don't have our handheld mic here today. I'm going to make sure we have it next week. But I'm going to ask people who are here, if you're here to speak up, and for those who are at home or wherever you are, that when I say, or when anyone says, but I'm going to say it now to you, when I say to you, when you hear the word Jew, what comes to your mind? What's the first thing that comes to your mind from your perspective? It doesn't have to be about you in particular, but when you hear the word Jew, what do you think? Anybody, jump in. The chosen people. That came from
Intelligent.
Mary Schwartz, the chosen people. Interesting. I think that's something we're going to talk about today. Anybody else?
Intelligence.
Intelligence. That was from?
Joyce.
It's Joyce.
Yes. You told me somebody's Jewish. I expect them to be intelligent. I don't know why, but that's just part of.
She hasn't.
what's in
Mike
my
says you
head.
haven't met her yet. She has met you, so she has met you. That's a really wild thing to say, Mike. We know you're intelligent. Don't say that. Anybody else? When you hear the word Jew, you don't like the term Jew. Why? What do you like? Jewish. You like Jewish. Interesting. Mike says he doesn't like the. Yeah, Mike likes the term Jew. Mike likes the term Jewish, but not the term Jew. Interesting, right? Because if you think about it, Jewish sounds like, kind of, right? He's Jew. No, he's Jewish. We don't really think. I mean, you might have thought about it, but a lot of people don't think about that. They say, I'm Jewish. The emphasis on ish. Anybody else?
Well,
Anywhere.
Mark, wasn't the term Jew, the word to call somebody a Jew was considered a slur as opposed to saying somebody was Jewish.
There definitely is a harshness to it that I think people, that I think some people equate with it. Well, wait a second. But of goy, that's what Esther says. Is Jew and goy, like it's okay. She says so. Esther's point is that it's kind of hard, it's kind of like a very firm. It sounds like very definitive. But Judith, you said that's what the historic, or that's what. But what do you? I mean, are you saying that's your feeling about it too?
No, it's
Okay.
just I've heard that people view it that way. When I think of somebody who's Jewish, I think not Jesus. I think like Joyce Schulman, I think intelligent, or at least well educated, not necessarily intelligent, well educated. Throw in a little Hebrew, throw in a little Israel on that, and then as I put in the chat, to be a Jew and to be Jewish, they're kind of different.
Interesting. Well, it's a tough one, definitely to start. We're starting with a hard question because it's not like some of the topics that we're going to talk about where you can say, well, this is the history of it, this is where it came from, because a lot of it is emotional. A lot of our definition, or personal definition, or what we attach to the term of Judaism, Jewish, is emotional. It's an emotional reaction, and it's not even necessarily something we can answer, because I'm going to tell you that this is a tough one. This is a tough one to start with, but we have to, because again, what is it? What is Judaism? How do we define it? And part of it is because, like many things that we're going to be talking about, there's been a historical development. Thousands of years of there being Jews means that the term has changed, and in some ways it's changing right in front of us right now. It's literally changing right now in front of us as some of the ways that we've defined ourselves, or I'd say the majority of people have defined themselves over the last 70 something years, is starting to change as well. So we have a hard time even holding on to it, because maybe there was an established understanding of what it meant to be a Jew or Jewish over the last 7 years, but it's changing right in front of us. And I would say it's changing, and we're still at the beginning of maybe one of those changes. So we may not even be able to imagine what it's going to look like. I think we can maybe postulate and maybe think about what it might look like, but I think there's a chance we don't even know what it's going to look like, especially in America over the next generation or two. But we can say, historically, when we first talk about what it means to be a Jew, there was a time when Judaism was defined, Jewishness was really defined as a tribe, right? As a family. It started according to the Bible, and again, according to, like, we can now say genetically, we can now say also archaeologically, that there was a time when the Jewish people were a tribe. They were a large family and then a tribe. And we know that because, again, the DNA tells us. We can now establish through, and in some ways, even more than we could have even 30 or 40 years ago, we can say there was a time when the Jews had a common DNA. And there was a time when they could trace back to families, to certain families. And so the Bible says that, this is the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their wives and their concubines, because we have to also give credit to the concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah. They had some of the tribes. So yeah, these were families, and the Bible tells us about those families. And again, that might only be part of the story, right? We can kind of maybe also now through archaeology and through other DNA research say that maybe our family wasn't that far removed from the Canaanites and some of the other people that live in that area. Well, parts of the Bible tell us that, yeah, we were related to the Moabites and to the Ammonites. And we're going to talk about those a little bit when we get to the Bible times, talking about biblical history. But there was a time when we were a people that was really defined as a family. But by the time that the Bible is even finished, we are not a family anymore. Even again, within the Torah itself, by the time of the Exodus, it says that there were people who left Egypt who were not just Israelite. They were no longer just people from the tribes. It says that there was a mixed multitude of people that went up. And so the Bible itself says that. And then again, later on, we can see that there are people who attach themselves to the Jewish people, like Ruth. And the story of Ruth tells us that a Moabite woman, who also happens to be the great grandmother of King David, our greatest king, was not an Israelite. And so we start to see that even within the Bible, it's not just an ethnicity. It's not just a DNA that makes you a Jew. So that it starts to move from a tribal identity to some type of religious and a conscious decision on living by a certain set of principles.
There's
By the
another aspect.
Sorry, yeah.
Depending on where you live, it could be a privilege or it could be dangerous and bad to be Jewish or good to be Jewish, depending on where you live on this earth.
Well, yeah. So Joyce's point, I think, is well taken, because it was like that in the Bible, right? So we learn in Egypt that being a Jew in Egypt became very, very problematic. There are
Yes.
other times when it's not problematic. So the Bible tells us that even again, wherever we lived, whether again that was in Egypt, but there were also times living in Israel that it was tough to be a Jew. During the time of the destruction of the temple that we just commemorated at Tisha B'Av, it was tough being a Jew in Jerusalem. So yes, it also depends. Sometimes it's defined by the anti-Semitism. Now, what's interesting is in the Bible itself, and we're going to talk about this right now, as something that nobody brought it up exactly, but I will tell you, there was still this issue of, but are you a Jew by birth? And particularly the issue of matrilineal versus patrilineal descent. And what's interesting is that in the Bible itself, in the Bible, it is really your father that determines your Judaism. It is in the Bible. And we know it because we have not just one, I say actually virtually most of the biblical characters that you know, the Jewish men that you know, were married to someone who was not an Israelite. Going back to, let's say Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all marry within their families, their cousins, right? They marry into the family of Terach, right? Which we'll look at again when we go back to the Bible. But Moses marries a Midianite woman named Zipporah. Well, actually, even before that, Joseph marries an Egyptian woman named Osnat. But Moses marries a Midianite woman, and King David marries several women, including some of them who were not Israelite. And Solomon marries, 300 women and 1,000 concubines, most of them not being Israelite, including the mother of his heir, Rehoboam, whose mother is an Ammonite. And so there are so many characters in the Bible who are married to Gentile women that it's literally, again, and we mentioned Ruth, who converted but was also not born Jewish, that it's actually more common. Now we're about to read a story in the book of Ezra that there was a time when this was a big issue, especially Israelite men being married to non-Israelite women. But the fact that it is an issue in the book of Ezra tells you that it was a big issue over 2,000 years ago. That was 2,400 years ago. So this was an issue. But it was in the rabbinic period where it changed. So the rabbis made a conscious decision to affirm in the Talmud that it is the mother that determines the Jewish identity. Now, this is a big issue because, again, within the Reform movement, we allow a mother or a father to determine the Judaism of the child. Part of the rationale for the Reform movement doing that was because they knew that during the biblical period that it was part of reality that the Father could determine it as well. And so I will tell you, and again, this is one of the things that we'll look at, and I will tell you that as we look at resources that are there are times, and people ask me all the time about, outside resources and what kinds of things they can look at for information. I do use oftentimes, and I think it's, generally a good source is Wikipedia. So this is the Wikipedia piece on matrilineality. I'm trying to stop the audio from being there. Sorry. Let me just do this. So this is the Wikipedia page on it. So as it says here, matrilineal descent is observed in Orthodox Judaism and Conservative Judaism, whereas Reform Judaism and Reconstructionist Judaism accept full Jewishness through either parent. Reform response, however, requires an exclusively Jewish upbringing. Patrilineal descent was observed by the ancient Israelites and is still observed by the Samaritan and Karaite Judaism, which asserts that only the Hebrew Bible by itself, that is, disregarding the oral traditions of Rabbinic Judaism, is legally and religiously binding. So it's not just the Reform movement of today, but Karaite and Samaritans who didn't follow the Talmud and who didn't follow, they only kind of used the Bible as their, and for the Samaritans, only the first 6 books of the Bible through Joshua as their text. They said, look, if you read the Bible, it's the Father. The rabbis decided to do this, again, because the change from patrilineal to matrilineal descent took place in the 1st century, yet the precise date of the shifting is disputed. Most people think that it came about because of the frequency of Jewish women being raped by Roman soldiers, and the fact that rather than determine that the children of these unions would be not allowed to come in the community, the rabbis actually were doing something out of an empathy and a desire to not marginalize so many people. And so that's the theory of how it became matrilineal. The argument within the Reform movement was, hey, look, we're going to tell you the child has to be raised in a certain, in the Jewish way. It has to be determined that the child was raised Jewish for us to consider the child Jewish. I will say that most Reform rabbis are somewhat lenient on that, but if this child wasn't really raised Jewish, I would, and many Reform rabbis would definitely encourage the person who had a Jewish parent but was not raised Jewish to go through a conversion, or if not calling it a conversion, an affirmation of their Jewish identity. But that's, again, if they were not raised with Judaism. So this is the development of this. And again, it's one of the things that I'm going to share with you is, the link to this. Look, when we think about, where we are today, this issue of patrilineal and matrilineal descent is a major issue. It's a major issue, and it's a major issue because interfaith marriage has become such a reality, and again, if it's more than 50% of the marriages, then, I mean, look, it's the majority of marriages. So you have to discuss it. You have to have an answer for it. And when you consider that the fact that conversion was not supposed to be done for the sake of marriage or for the sake of how you raise a child, because it's not. It's considered to be an ulterior motive. You're not supposed to convert to Judaism for marriage. It's supposed to be a personal decision and one that comes from a person's own heart, not because they feel compelled to do it and feel the pressure. Because the feeling is like, if God forbid the marriage ends, then the person's connection to Judaism would end. So look, it's a big issue. It's an issue that's played out in my own home. So I will tell you that, when my daughter's boyfriend Jack went through conversion last November, they don't have a date for their marriage, which was, surprising to the Beit Din at University at the AJU at the RA, the conservative mikveh that they went through, that they didn't have a date yet of marriage. But most of the people they see, they know that they're going through a marriage, or they've gone through a marriage, and maybe they're about to have children. The last conversion that I did actually was a woman who was married already. She was married just a little over a year ago, and then she went through the conversion before she had a child. She wanted to go. She didn't want to rush to do it before her marriage, but she wanted to do it before she had a child. So, these are living, breathing issues, and one of the things that we're going to do over the course of this journey is talk about these things as they're playing out now, because this isn't just a class in history. This is a class in a journey that is contemporary. It's the stuff that we're dealing with today. And it's, yes, question. Yes. Well, she is not pregnant yet. No, but if she was pregnant, the baby would be Jewish. As long as she went through conversion before the baby came out, baby's Jewish. Yep. No, it's a good question. Yes. So it is a good question. Yeah, but the mikveh is covered. The mikveh covers the baby before it comes out, which, by the way, is interesting, because then it also kind of implies certain things about the fetus, which is that it's still very much a part of the mom, right? We'll talk about that when we talk about some of the other subjects we've got. Yep. But it is an interesting one. So that is, that is a debate that goes on today over the matrilineal descent. And so Mike says the people that are 100% Ashkenazi. Yeah. Well, what's interesting about that is somebody could be 100% Ashkenazi nowadays and have very little connection to Judaism. On the other hand, there could be somebody who is 10% Jewish who has a very deep connection to Judaism. These are things that happen. Yeah, but these are things that happen today that never happened before. And so that's why this is a very relevant issue. It's one that, again, one can make the argument we haven't had for a long time. It's interesting because for a long time, this issue of converting for marriage wasn't an issue, because nobody converted to Judaism. Nobody wanted to be Jewish. First of all, if any Jew and Gentile got married, the kids were going to be raised not Jewish, and the family's Judaism was pretty much obliterated. The idea that people are now choosing, and the majority of people in interfaith marriages who are now, if they opt for a religion or opting for Judaism, that never happened. It hasn't happened at least for 2,000 years. I mean, you literally have to go back to the Bible, because you had to have been in a situation to some extent in the Bible where the Jews had a majority of the population in their homeland, in the land of Israel. And if somebody was a Moabite or an Ammonite or an Egyptian who married into the people, then yeah, they wanted to be part of the people because they were the people of the land, right? And we assumed that's why they would do it. And the Bible talks about that. I mean, the Bible mentions it. It says that it happened. But that makes sense. If you're a persecuted minority in virtually every country that you live in for the last 2,000 years, who is going to make the decision to become Jewish? Didn't happen. It happened, but very rarely. It took almost a sense of masochism for somebody to do that. The converting and marrying somebody and becoming not Jewish anymore was your ticket into contemporary and the majority of the society. I mean, that's the happy ending in The Merchant of Venice, folks. If you recall, that Shylock's daughter ends up marrying a Gentile and gets to be freed from this. That's when Shakespeare wrote it. That's why, people say it's anti-Semitic. I mean, there's anti-Semitic trope in it, but it's not anti-Semitic. It's the reality of what Shakespeare didn't have to write another reality. He didn't have to. He just wrote what he saw, and for him, that just made sense. So that's the reality. That was the reality, and now this is the reality today, which has changed a lot. It's also, of course, changed because of Israel. And so we're going to talk about that. But any other questions about that? I want to say that there is a major debate that's going on right now. It's not necessarily this issue, and maybe we'll talk about it when we talk about life cycle, but I want to talk about it today because it's literally playing out right now. It's literally part of the discussion of what's happening in our world right now. And again, it's wonderful to have so many people here tonight, and some of you, in your own journeys and in your own lives have seen how this plays out. But I do want to share with you this, which is that this is happening right now. The conservative movement is no longer able to fight this off anymore. This is an article from last month, my friends. This is a Dot Jeshurun, which is a synagogue in Minneapolis, in Minnetonka. It's a large, I've had relatives who are members of this synagogue. It's one of the largest synagogues in the Twin City area, and it's now allowing their rabbis to participate, not officiate, but participate. Seems like a interesting. Well, they didn't want to break off from the conservative movement, so they didn't break the rule, so to speak. But this is a major change, and so this is. This woman, Joanna Dolkin, is one of the leaders of the Cantors Assembly, which is the conservative cantors union, if you will. So these are major players. These are not like little schleppers from the suburbs. This is a major synagogue, right? And so the conservative movement has been kind of fighting this because they've been trying to be accepting of interfaith families. They've been saying that we're a home for them, but at the same time, they're saying their clergy couldn't even go to the wedding. That's the way it used to be. They couldn't even go to their kids' wedding. And trust me, there were people who went to their kids' weddings. There were conservative rabbis, I know them for the last 30 or 40 years, whose kids married people who were not Jewish, and they went to the wedding. And they had a Reform colleague usually perform the wedding, because usually they did have a Jewish wedding, but they went to the wedding. They just didn't make a big deal about it. Well, now they can even say something during the wedding. They just can't sign the certificate, maybe, if you will. But it's getting more serious than that. What? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was an issue. It has been an issue, but it's now becoming one where, again, this is playing out in front of us. And that's why I'm saying this is not just a class on history. This is a class on what's happening around us. This article is not from last month. This is from JTA. This is from this week. This story about another conservative rabbi, and I don't know him, but I know we have some mutual friends. This guy, third generation conservative rabbi, resigned because he was sick and tired of following a rule that he didn't agree with. And so he stepped down from the conservative movement. He was not currently serving a conservative congregation, so it didn't really affect his job. But he said, I'm not going to be a member of the RA, the Rabbinic Assembly. I'm not going to be a member of it anymore because I don't want to, I'm going to do interfaith ceremonies, and I don't want you to tell me that I'm going to be censured. And so this is what he did. So this is this week. So, this article says it's well known that many rabbis serving conservative movement are participating in interfaith weddings. Don't ask, don't tell is the status quo. Says the former, it's Karen McGinnity, which sounds like she's married to somebody who wasn't. At some point, I'm guessing that McGinnity was not a Jewish guy. She wrote on the Facebook, so this is, and it quoted, of course, what Dot Jeshurun had just done. So yeah, this is happening in front of our eyes. This is not exactly the question of who's a Jew, but it is reflective of the dilemma that people are having now. That is one of, yeah, but are we really saying that we don't live in this world, right? This world where a majority of the look, on a personal level, I thought as a kid, like I would never be a member of a Reformed synagogue, let alone be the rabbi of a Reformed synagogue. But I did not, and as I became an adult, could not wrap my head around the idea that somebody who's part of an interfaith family should be marginalized in their community. Couldn't do it. So when I started off in conservative rabbinical school, folks, I was at the University of Judaism when it was still called the University of Judaism in 1994 or 1993. I couldn't do it. I was like, what am I going to do? I'm going to finish rabbinical school, and then I'm going to leave, because there's no way that if somebody comes to me and says, I want you to officiate at a wedding, and the person that I'm marrying is not Jewish, that I can legitimately look at them in the eyes and say, sorry, can't do it. I knew I wouldn't do it. So what am I going to go through the rabbinical, I talked to people about it. They said, yeah, just, things will change, and things haven't changed enough. I mean, they've changed, but well, I should have waited to 2025 and then what would I have done? I would have done what this guy did, resign, step away from the movement. So it was ridiculous. I wasn't going to do it. And so I didn't, and I wasn't going to pretend or be a don't ask, don't tell, wink, wink, I'm doing this. So that's why, and that's why I could never be at a conservative synagogue. Was I would not subscribe to, I would not tell people that, and I wouldn't pretend. So that's why. Otherwise, I agree with a lot of the principles of conservative Judaism, but I would not do that. So, yes. Yes. There are. Of course there are. So Mike said there's a lot of interfaith families at Congregation Beth Shalom. Of course there are. But the question is, do you send a message to people that, we kind of accept you, but we don't really accept you. We would never come to your wedding. So I don't like it. I don't like it. I don't like the message it sends. I definitely encourage people to make a decision if they feel ready to convert to Judaism, but I would never want people to feel compelled to do it. And I would never want people to feel that, well, we don't really know what to do with you, but we will pretend that we support this, but we really don't. To me, it's hypocritical. And I don't like that. I don't like it in religion. I don't like it in anything.
That she would never have married my son and daughter to the kids, but she would never have done the intermarriage. So that seems like you're jumping over a.
That was a Reformed synagogue. So yeah. So what Esther was saying is that the rabbi at a Reformed synagogue said she would never have, because rabbis at Reformed synagogues who won't perform interfaith marriages, but she would bat mitzvah the kid. Yeah. Well, she had to. It doesn't. But, yeah, it goes on. It's a discussion again that happens, and again, it's not that it's not that I have any issue with, I'm not a big patron of any of the movements, and we'll talk about that when we talk about movements, but we look at American Judaism and talk about movement affiliation. It's never been a big issue for me one way or the other. But I'm not going to be hypocritical. I'm not going to say that I support that, I support families, but I can't really support, I don't really support you. Anyways, it sits poorly with me. So the interesting thing is this is the side of, but this is how it plays out in America, and this is how it plays out in our synagogues and in our Jewish camps, by the way, because this also plays out in Jewish camps. For kids who want to go to say a conservative camp, are they Jewish, right? And so some Jewish camps have said, we're going to take kids of interfaith families where the father is Jewish and not the mother, and some Jewish camps have said, no, we're not. So this does play out in American Judaism. But there's another issue, and that is how it plays out in Israel, and how it plays out specifically in the law of return. And so let's take a look at that. For people who are not that familiar with the law of return, understand that Israel decided in its formation that they were going to allow people to come to Israel and to be Israeli citizens who were determined by their community and by themselves to be Jewish. But Israel has an Orthodox orientation when it comes to their religious system, right? Because there's only a chief rabbinate of Israel that's Orthodox. There's a Ashkenazi version and a Sephardic version of those, but they're only Orthodox. And so Israel had this issue where the system of religion in the country was governed by the Orthodox, but they knew that most of the people around the world were not Orthodox. And so they had to essentially say that if a community had determined that that person was Jewish, then the person could become a citizen of Israel with full rights to living in Israel, to serving in the military, obviously, to getting benefits, to being a full citizen under the law. And so the law of return was challenged by this issue because there was a very famous case in 1970, which I will show you, where this identity was challenged in a way that we wouldn't have in America because we don't have something like this, which is a definition from a legal standpoint. This is the Jerusalem Post from 1970. And while the law originally in Israel said that, the person who is a Jew would be determined by the community, they had to come up with a solution with this case, which was the case in 1962 of Brother Daniel, who was a Carmelite monk who was born as a Jew, Oswald Rufeisen, in Poland. He was converted to Catholicism. He hid during the war in a monastery, and he ended up becoming very close to the monks, and he became Catholic. And he loved his Catholic religion, but he still felt that he was ethnically Jewish. And it put the Israeli rabbinic authorities in a little bit of a quandary because they held he's Jewish. His mother and father were both Jewish. He's Jewish. And they said he's Jewish. But the Israeli Supreme Court, which was trying to rule on this decision not as a religious court, because the Supreme Court in Israel, by the way, is actually in some cases anti-religious. I wouldn't say it's anti-religious, but it's not sympathetic always to the religious, which is actually a good check and balance, by the way, in the country. Their Supreme Court is the one that's like trying to make sure that the laws don't exempt religious Jews from serving in the military and doing the things that you need to do in order to be an Israeli citizen beyond just serving in the military. But they were kind of put in this situation of ruling on this. And so the Supreme Court said that the Israeli Supreme Court said that somebody who became Christian could no longer be a Jew. That's what the Israeli Supreme Court decided, but it didn't matter because he was still allowed to make Aliyah, and he was allowed to become a citizen, even though the Supreme Court said he shouldn't be. He was allowed to, and it was an interesting case of the fact that Israel established these guidelines that the person had to be Jewish, they had to practice Judaism. And so today, if somebody makes Aliyah and they're not Orthodox, which is the majority of people who come to me, who come from our synagogue, and we've had several young people who have made Aliyah, I have to write a letter oftentimes to the Israeli government saying, I know this person to be Jewish. And I usually put in that I know that the person's mother is Jewish, so that there's also a determination there that even according to halakha, according to Jewish law, the person is halachically Jewish by the Orthodox. Though again, the Orthodox rabbinate there is probably going to question him a little bit more, or her, when they get married. But from the standpoint of becoming a citizen, I've never been questioned about any of the letters that I've written. And I haven't counted how many I've written, but I've written at least a couple dozen over the last 25 years. There's also a case, this case was an interesting one, where the person was actually married to someone who was not Jewish. It was an Israeli naval officer, Benjamin Shalit, and he married a woman who was not Jewish outside of the land of Israel. He couldn't be married to you can't in Israel be married to someone who's not Jewish. A rabbi in Israel won't officiate. But this guy got married in outside of Israel, and he went back to Israel, and he wanted his children registered as a Jew, and because the mother wasn't Jewish, the rabbinate didn't want to have the kids be considered Jewish, but the court the Supreme Court decided that the kids are Jewish and should be allowed to or be citizens. So this has become an issue in Israel, and it's one that as the Orthodox have taken a stronger role in the last couple of governments, they've been pushing to make it a little bit tougher for people who are not Orthodox to make Aliyah. They also know that they can't really change it because that is a pushback that they'd get from the majority of Israeli citizens who themselves are not Orthodox. And as long as they don't really change the status quo, it's probably not going to be an issue. So there is debate that goes on in Israel over this, and at least for the time being, it's not going to change. I would never want to say it's never going to change. I would never want to be the person who said I can't see it ever changing. But at least for now, it's not an issue. If anybody goes to Israel with a mother who is not Jewish, they can still be a citizen of Israel. Again, when it comes to getting married in Israel, they all have a hard time, and by that I mean an impossible time, to find a rabbi who would officiate at their wedding, but they can always get married outside of Israel and come back and have a family and do everything as a citizen of Israel. They just have to go to Cyprus or America or England or wherever else to get married and then come back to Israel and have their family. And there's people who do that all the time. They just don't want to put up with the Israeli religious bureaucracy. So, look, I will tell you this. There was also an issue, and I'll be very frank about it. It's not something that I'm proud of, but up till about 30 years ago, and I would say it's kind of had a lot to do with computers and like better data and stuff like that. You could find rabbis in Israel that would sign off on stuff. There were rabbis who were Orthodox rabbis who were known to be able to be bribed to sign off on a wedding that was not legal. You can't do that really anymore. They've cracked down on it. It's a lot easier to find out information now because of the stuff being all. In the old days, it was on a piece of paper and it was filed, and maybe they did a microfilm of it, but it wasn't like it is today. So, and they stopped those rabbis from being able to, they can't do that anymore. So it used to be able to be done. And people just kind of turned a blind eye to it and just knew it happened, and it happened, but it doesn't happen very much. I'm not saying if somebody tells me they know that it happened last year, it would not surprise me. I just know that it's a lot harder, and people they're not doing that anymore for the most part. So that's how it plays out in Israel. So who's a Jew there is actually a really big issue. So and the last part of what I want to talk to you about today is, so what does it mean the way we live Judaism when we talk about who's a Jew and what is the way we define Judaism today. One of the people who I think kind of summarized or made it understandable was one of the great rabbis of the last century in the United States, a man who actually lived 102 years, Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan. And he was a rabbi who came from Europe, settled in New York, and was the rabbi for Jewish Theological Seminary as a professor. His students at the Conservative Seminary at JTS were disciples. I mean, he was not necessarily the charismatic or he was not the mystical rabbi that his colleague Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was, but he was much more of an intellectual, and he was a brilliant rabbi. And his followers ended up starting a new form of Judaism. Because as you can see, his book that he published in 1934 was called Toward a Reconstruction of American Jewish Life. And so he was the father of Reconstructionism. Now, interestingly, he was not himself, he did not call himself a Reconstructionist Jew. He didn't necessarily even tell his people to go out and start another form of Judaism. It is the smallest movement in American Judaism. It has its own seminary in Philadelphia. There are not many Reconstructionist synagogues in the country. There are even fewer on the West Coast. It just so happens that the nearest Reconstructionist synagogue is Kehilat Israel, known as KI, in Palisades, which amazingly survived the fires. I mean, I went by it right after the fires, and I'm like, this was a miracle. And KI, all the rabbis who were there lost their homes. I mean, the three rabbis in the cantor who were there, Cantor Chaim Frankel has been there for years and years. They all lost their homes. But the synagogue stayed. The synagogue survived and is going to reopen. And it's had damage, but everything in Palisades had damage, but it survived. Interestingly, KI was in the news recently because they have broken off from the Reconstructionist movement. They have now said we're no longer Reconstructionists, and why? Because they don't like the Reconstructionist position on Israel. And this literally just happened. KI, actually, I don't know that it's still in process because I don't think they've taken their congregational vote, but they're actually disassociating from Reconstructionists. So Reconstructionists are going to lose one of their biggest synagogues very soon. But they did not feel that the Reconstructionist movement was supporting Israel enough, and they said we're not going to stand by while this happens. So that being said, I think I read that the actual hit to the Reconstructionist movement is minimal because the synagogues don't give that much to the movement. So as far as dollars go, it would be similar, by the way, as Lisa Barton, who's here, who's our treasurer, will tell you that if we left the Reform movement, they would not care. They do not live off of our donation to them. But I guess if lots of synagogues left the Reform movement, it would not be good. But Mordechai Kaplan was a pioneer of American Jewish thought. He loved this country. He wrote some really wonderful books about American Jewry, and he was one of the ones who kind of led the country in like the 40s and 50s of trying to embrace like the move to the suburbs and making sure that Jews figured out institutions that would meet their needs. So he was a big advocate for Jewish community centers. And so he really loved the idea that JCCs would be built, which would be places where there would be Jewish learning, but there'd also be sports, there'd be preschools, there'd be Jewish life that was not just synagogue related. And this is kind of a summary. This was what he said about Judaism. And I would say he didn't say this about American Judaism, but I think it really is American Judaism. To some extent, I think there's a truth to all modern forms of Judaism. But what he said about Judaism is the composite of the collective thoughts, sentiments, and efforts of the Jewish people. In other words, Judaism is the sum total of all the manifestations of the distinctively Jewish national spirit. The Jewish religion is then only a part of Judaism, though by far its most important part. Besides religion, there were and still are other elements in Judaism. And I think that's a wonderful thing for us to kind of like think of as we finish up here, which is that Judaism is not just a religion. It's not just an ethnicity. He kind of argued that it's more of a civilization, which this is not his, he actually used that term in another book he wrote called Judaism as a Civilization. But there isn't a very easy way of saying what Judaism is an ethnicity, is this, because it's all of those things. And it's also none of them by it themselves. So it's not just a civilization. I sometimes tell people that Judaism, the closest thing to like understanding what Judaism is and who a Jew is and I've said this, people here know that I've said this, the Armenians are probably the closest to us in the sense that they have a church. And of course, in America, they have a few churches because they have a kind of a reform version of the Armenian church here. But the Armenians had a culture, a language, a religion, and they had a lot of these elements. But obviously, you don't hear about people becoming Armenian. There are people who join the Armenian church if they marry an Armenian, but they don't really become Armenian. They become part of the community. Same with Greek Orthodox. And I'd say a lot of churches that are ethnic churches, the Ethiopic church, the Ethiopian church, which is a very old church too. People would associate that there's a religious component and also some type of ethnic and linguistic and cultural component to it. But Judaism is definitely something that has a religious component that's very, very important. And again, as Kaplan says, is, its most important part, but there is more than that. And so that's why, I kind of use when people want an understanding of what is a Jew and what is Judaism, I think he probably summarized it at least as a way to kind of like help guide us through this, is a way of understanding it. Other people have talked about what's called the three-legged stool of Judaism, which is that there's three legs to this thing that we sit on and that we are supported by. The three legs are God, Torah, and Israel. There's a theological component, which we're going to look at. There's the Torah component, which we'll also look at. And then there's the Israel component, which is not necessarily the nation of Israel, though that is an expression of it. And as we know today, it's become problematic for us because, is Israel just a nation now? Or again, is it, are we starting to like understand that Israel is the people of Israel, including the nation of Israel, but also us that don't live in Israel? And so Israel is understood to be not the nation of Israel. This formula of God, Torah, and Israel existed before there was a nation of Israel. So this is the people of Israel. So there's a peoplehood. There's a connection to the text and to the law and to the ways of Judaism through the Torah. And then there's also what we would say is a component of theology, of belief. None of these things are independent of each other. They're all interdependent and they're all parts of each other, and they can't exist without the others. But it's an interesting idea. And so what comes down to us in a sense, and what I probably kind of encourage people to kind of come out of tonight thinking about, is how is our Judaism, how is our identity, how does it manifest, how is it lived, through through the holidays that we celebrate, through the books that we read. And I'm not just talking about the Bible. I'm talking about the books that we read, whether it's a fiction book or whether it's something that we read in the newspaper or the article that we're reading on the internet. The cultural traditions that we have, including the foods, including the things that make us feel Jewish when we eat them or listen to them, the music that we listen to. And again, the prayers and the belief systems that we have, which I think, we're going to talk about those, and we're going to talk about those actually next week, which is, how does the connection that we have theologically, which is obviously another problematic one, because I would argue, and you're going to see next week as we look at, it's developed over time. Judaism's the Jewish ideas about God are not, there's one God maybe, but there's a whole lot of ways of approaching that one God. And I would actually argue that each person individually has their own theology. There are similarities that we might have in some of our theological beliefs, but it's very unlikely that the person that you're sitting next to, the person you go home to every night, and the person that you talk to the most, and the people that you are around the most, including your kids and your parents and your spouse and everybody else, has the same exact belief that you do. I don't believe it. So I think everybody has their own personal connection, which we'll talk about. And so that is the religious component of this. So I do want to share, and again, I'm going to pop it in here, the read more about it. And when we have a chance to look at these things, I definitely would encourage you to read more about Mordecai Kaplan. And here's again an interesting article that I'll share, which is it's just a really good kind of like simple read, and I mean simple. When I share these things, and I'm gonna like I said, I'm gonna share this for everybody. When I share something, it's going to be something that's very readable, and that is, in this case, you can see is like 3 pages. This is from the Pluralism Project, Harvard University. So this is, these are all going to be very readable articles and ways for people to read more. So I'm gonna pop this in the chat, and then I'll also pop it up on our. This will be recorded. This is recorded, but it will be put up on our YouTube channel, which has got. If you miss a class, feel free to watch it later. I don't know. It usually will take anywhere from a couple hours to a day to get it up there for you. But we'll also have links to the read more about it every week. So thank you everybody for being here and for making this something that not only that we can all learn and grow from, and again, maybe in the future, more people who are joining us remotely can also share. But as I said, some of the times we will all be remote, and so we'll all have that. We'll all be on the same. We'll all be on the same wavelength. We'll all have the same equally connected or disconnected situation as we do this. So, thank you everybody for being here as the journey starts. And again, for those who are watching it after the fact, you're still with us, even though you were not here at the moment. You were still part of the journey. So, thank you everybody, and we will see you at the same time next week. And if you want to join us again for the text classes, the Tuesday morning, those are going to be continuing at least for the next few months. We'll be reading the last couple of books of the Bible. We're reading the book of Ezra starting next week. And the book of Ezra, as I mentioned, does have a story about how interfaith marriage was a problem, at least for Ezra, that he had to deal with. And you may not like the way he dealt with it. So good evening, everybody, and thank you all for being here. And again, feel free to download this information that popped up. But if you don't, you'll get it later. Take care, everybody. Have a great rest of the week. And we'll see you hopefully
Thank you,
Friday
Rabbi.
night. Friday night for our
Thank you.
service.
Thank you.
Rick and Addie. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
And as you see,
Two chats.
at 8:30.
Bye, David and Cheryl.
Hey, Joyce.
Joyce,
Good night, everybody.
love you.